The morning briefing room at Fort Bragg buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy. Maps covered every available surface, satellite images scattered across tables like deadly confetti. Colonel Sarah Chen stood near the back wall, her arms crossed, watching as junior officers shuffled papers and checked their equipment one final time. She had been at Bragg for exactly 72 hours. 3 days of paperwork, orientation meetings, and the kind of polite skepticism that followed every new transfer. The 82nd Airborne had its reputation to protect, and nobody was particularly interested in breaking in another desk jockey from the Pentagon. That was fine by Sarah. She preferred it that way. The door burst open with military precision, and General Marcus Williams entered like a force of nature. 6'4", shoulders that could support a small aircraft, and eyes that had seen too much combat to tolerate much nonsense. Every conversation in the room died instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we have a situation developing in the Balkans. Hostiles have taken a diplomatic facility, and we need boots on the ground within 18 hours. Sarah watched as the general's gaze swept across the room, cataloging faces, measuring capabilities. This was how real military leadership worked. Not the sanitized version they taught in war colleges, but the raw assessment of human resources under pressure. "This is not a standard extraction," Williams continued. "Intelligence suggests the hostiles have military training, possibly former special forces. They know we're coming and they're prepared for conventional tactics." Captain Rodriguez, a young man whose confidence outweighed his experience, raised his hand. "Sir, what kind of numbers are we looking at?" 12 hostiles, fortified position, civilian hostages scattered throughout the building. The kind of scenario that turns heroes into casualties if handled incorrectly. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. She knew these situations, had lived through variations of them in places most people couldn't pronounce. But Fort Bragg didn't know that yet. All they saw was another transfer with a clean uniform and suspicious paperwork. Williams pulled down a large-scale map of the target area. The facility sits on elevated ground, natural choke points on 3 sides, single-access road which they've undoubtedly mined or booby-trapped. Standard approach gets everyone killed. The room fell silent except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of helicopters conducting training exercises. Sarah studied the map, her mind automatically calculating angles, timing, resource requirements. Old habits died hard. "We need someone who understands unconventional warfare," Williams said, his eyes beginning another sweep of the room. "Someone who's operated in hostile territory without support, without backup, without the luxury of overwhelming firepower." Lieutenant Morrison, fresh from Ranger School, leaned forward eagerly. "General, I've completed advanced tactical training in urban warfare scenarios." Williams nodded politely. "Excellent, Lieutenant. Your conventional training will be valuable for the support team." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. Morrison's face fell slightly, though he tried to hide his disappointment. Sarah recognized the expression. She'd worn it herself years ago, before learning that real combat bore little resemblance to training scenarios. "What we need," Williams continued, "is someone who's operated behind enemy lines, someone who understands that sometimes the mission requires creative solutions." Major Harrison, a decorated veteran with 2 Purple Hearts, straightened in his chair. "Sir, I've led 12 successful operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. My team has never failed to complete an objective." "Impressive record, Major. Your experience with coordinated team operations will be essential for logistics support." Another polite dismissal. Sarah began to understand what Williams was doing. He wasn't just briefing a mission. He was conducting an interview, searching for something specific that regular military credentials couldn't provide. Captain Stevens tried next, listing qualifications that would have impressed any recruiting board. Specialized training in demolitions, advanced sniper certification, counterterrorism experience. Williams listened with the patience of a man who'd heard similar presentations countless times. "All excellent qualifications, Captain. We'll need your expertise for perimeter security." The pattern was becoming clear. Every volunteer was qualified, experienced, decorated, and every volunteer was being politely assigned to support roles rather than mission command. Sarah remained silent, watching Williams work through his mental checklist. She understood his dilemma. The mission required someone with experience that didn't appear in official records, someone who'd operated in the gray areas between military doctrine and battlefield necessity. "Anyone else?" Williams asked, his voice carrying a note of controlled frustration. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, officers comparing qualifications, wondering what magical combination of experience the general was seeking. Sarah noticed several glances in her direction, though whether from curiosity or suspicion, she couldn't determine. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, a man whose reputation for strategic thinking was legendary at Bragg, cleared his throat. "General, perhaps if we understood more about the specific tactical requirements, we could better assess our capabilities." Williams nodded slowly. "Fair point, Colonel. This mission requires someone who's comfortable operating without rules of engagement, someone who's made life-and-death decisions without the benefit of command approval or strategic oversight." The room's energy shifted perceptibly. This wasn't standard military operation territory anymore. Williams was describing the kind of work that lived in classified files and unofficial histories. "We need someone who's been Specter," Williams said quietly. The word hit the room like a physical force. Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense involuntarily. Specter operations were the military's deepest secret. Missions that didn't officially exist, conducted by personnel who were never officially assigned to them. She'd hoped that part of her life would stay buried in classified archives. But looking at Williams' expression, she realized he knew exactly who he was talking to. "For those unfamiliar with the classification," Williams continued, "Specter operations are conducted by individuals who have demonstrated the ability to complete impossible missions through unconventional means. They operate alone, without support, and their success rates are statistically improbable." Captain Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, how many personnel have Specter classification?" "That information is classified, Captain. What I can tell you is that there are fewer than 50 active Specter operators worldwide, and most of their identities are known only to a select few individuals in military intelligence." Sarah watched as every officer in the room mentally reviewed their knowledge of their colleagues, searching for clues about who might carry such classification. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 days being politely dismissed as another Pentagon bureaucrat. Williams pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be personnel files. The mission parameters require someone with Specter experience. Without that qualification, this becomes a suicide mission disguised as a rescue operation. Major Harrison leaned forward. "General, with respect, surely our combined experience." "Major, your experience is invaluable, but this isn't about combined anything. This mission requires a single operator who can adapt to changing circumstances without consulting a manual or requesting permission." The room fell silent again. Sarah could feel the weight of expectation, the growing realization that someone in this room possessed qualifications none of them had suspected. Williams closed the tablet and looked directly at her for the first time since entering the room. "Colonel Chen," he said, his voice carrying a note of formality that hadn't been present before, "perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the tactical situation." Every head in the room turned towards Sarah. She felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated, measured, judged by people who had no idea what they were really looking at. "The facility's positioning suggests the hostiles understand military doctrine," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "They've chosen a location that neutralizes our technological advantages while maximizing their defensive capabilities." Williams nodded encouragingly. "Continue." "Conventional assault guarantees casualties among both our personnel and the civilian hostages. The hostiles know this, which means they're counting on us to follow standard protocols." "And your recommendation?" Sarah studied the map again, though she'd already memorized every detail. "The mission requires someone who's comfortable ignoring protocols when protocols become liabilities." "Interesting perspective, Colonel, and do you have experience with such flexible operational approaches?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah could feel every officer in the room waiting for her response, wondering what secret history their new colleague might be concealing. She looked directly at Williams, recognizing the challenge in his eyes. This wasn't really about the mission in the Balkans. This was about whether she was ready to acknowledge who she really was. "General," Sarah said quietly, "I believe every officer in this room has experience with flexible operational approaches. That's why we're here instead of behind desks in Washington." It was a diplomatic non-answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Williams smiled slightly, the expression of a man who recognized a skilled deflection when he heard one. "Indeed, Colonel, but some flexibility is more extensive than others." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Tell me, what would you do if conventional extraction proved impossible?" Sarah considered her options carefully. She could continue playing the role of careful Pentagon transfer, avoiding the implications of Williams' questions. Or she could acknowledge what both of them already knew. "That would depend on the mission parameters, sir. Are we prioritizing hostage safety, operational security, or strategic objectives?" "All three." "Then conventional extraction isn't an option. You'd need someone willing to operate outside standard engagement protocols." Captain Rodriguez looked confused. "Ma'am, what does that mean exactly?" Sarah glanced at Williams, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Permission to speak more freely. "It means, Captain, that some missions require operators to make decisions that don't appear in any manual, to use methods that work but can't be officially acknowledged." Major Harrison frowned. "You're talking about black operations." "I'm talking about successful operations," Sarah replied. "The color classification is irrelevant when civilian lives are at stake." The room's atmosphere shifted again. These were career military officers, comfortable with clearly defined rules and hierarchies. Sarah's casual discussion of operating outside official protocols made several of them visibly uncomfortable. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes leaned back in his chair. "Colonel Chen, your personnel file indicates administrative experience in strategic planning. Are we to understand you have operational experience as well?" The question carried multiple layers. Barnes was probing, trying to understand why a supposedly administrative officer was discussing tactical operations with such confidence. "Every military officer has operational experience, Colonel. The question is whether that experience prepared them for situations where standard procedures become obstacles rather than solutions." Williams stepped forward. "Perhaps we should be more direct. This mission requires someone with Specter classification. That's not a request or a preference. It's a requirement based on tactical analysis and historical precedent." Captain Stevens raised his hand. "Sir, none of our personnel files indicate Specter classification. How do we proceed?" "That's because Specter classification doesn't appear in standard personnel files, Captain. It's compartmentalized information accessible only through specific intelligence channels." Sarah watched as the officers processed this information. Most military careers operated within clearly defined boundaries. The existence of classification levels they'd never heard of challenged their understanding of how the system worked. "General," Major Harrison said slowly, "are you telling us that someone in this room has Specter classification?" "I'm telling you, Major, that this mission cannot succeed without Specter-level capabilities. Draw your own conclusions." The silence that followed was heavy with speculation. Sarah could see officers mentally reviewing every interaction they'd had with their colleagues, searching for clues about hidden qualifications. Lieutenant Morrison, still eager despite his earlier dismissal, leaned forward. "Sir, what exactly does Specter classification entail?" Williams considered the question carefully. "Specter operators are individuals who have demonstrated the ability to complete missions that conventional military doctrine considers impossible. They operate with minimal oversight, maximum autonomy, and success rates that defy statistical probability." "How minimal is minimal oversight?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "They receive mission objectives and operational boundaries. Everything between those parameters is left to their discretion." The implications of that statement rippled through the room. Military officers were trained to operate within strict command structures. The idea of autonomous decision-making on that scale was both fascinating and terrifying. "And the success rates?" Major Harrison inquired. "Classified, but I can tell you that Specter operations have a completion rate significantly higher than comparable conventional missions." Sarah remained silent, watching her colleagues struggle with concepts that had once been foreign to her as well. She remembered her first exposure to Specter protocols, the disorienting realization that everything she'd learned about military structure was only part of a larger picture. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was persistent. "General, if such capabilities exist within our current personnel, shouldn't that information be accessible to command staff?" "Colonel, much of what happens in military intelligence remains compartmentalized for good reason. Specter operations exist in a classification level that requires specific clearance and demonstrated need to know." "And you have such clearance?" "I have the clearance necessary to identify Specter-qualified personnel when mission parameters require it." Captain Stevens looked frustrated. "This feels like an elaborate guessing game, sir. If you know who you're looking for, why not simply make the assignment?" Williams smiled grimly. "Because Specter operators must volunteer, Captain. The psychological profile that makes them effective also makes them impossible to compel. They choose their missions based on factors that don't always align with traditional military thinking." Sarah understood the subtle pressure Williams was applying. He couldn't directly order her to reveal her classification, but he could create circumstances where concealing it became tactically irresponsible. "What happens if no one volunteers?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. "Then we proceed with conventional tactics and accept the probable casualties among both our personnel and the civilian hostages." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. These were officers who'd sworn to protect civilian lives. The idea of accepting preventable casualties violated everything they'd trained for. Major Harrison broke the silence. "General, what specific capabilities distinguish Specter operations from advanced special forces training?" "Psychological flexibility, primarily. Special forces operate within established parameters, even when those parameters are unconventional. Specter operators redefine parameters in real time based on tactical necessities." "Can you give us an example?" Williams paused, choosing his words carefully. "Imagine a hostage situation where standard protocol calls for negotiation, followed by tactical assault. Special forces might modify the assault approach based on intelligence updates. A Specter operator might eliminate the hostage takers before they realize they're under attack." Captain Rodriguez looked confused. "Isn't that just preemptive action?" "Preemptive action still operates within engagement protocols. Specter operators create their own protocols based on mission requirements and acceptable risk assessment." Sarah watched as her colleagues tried to process the implications. They were career military officers, comfortable with clearly defined rules of engagement. The concept of operators who functioned outside those rules challenged their fundamental understanding of military structure. "This conversation is starting to sound like we're discussing assassination rather than rescue operations," Lieutenant Colonel Barnes said quietly. "We're discussing mission completion using whatever methods prove necessary," Williams replied. "Sometimes those methods align with conventional tactics, sometimes they don't." The room fell silent again. Sarah could feel the weight of expectation, the growing pressure to either volunteer or explain why she wasn't volunteering. "General," she said finally, "you're describing capabilities that require extensive practical experience. How do we verify that theoretical knowledge translates to operational effectiveness?" Williams smiled, recognizing the opening she'd provided. "An excellent question, Colonel. Perhaps you'd like to share your assessment of what such verification might entail." Every officer in the room turned toward Sarah again. This time, the attention felt different. Less curiosity, more anticipation. They were beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't really about identifying capabilities. It was about acknowledgement. "Verification would require examining historical performance under comparable conditions," Sarah said carefully. "Mission completion rates, casualty minimization, operational security maintenance. And if such records existed but remained classified, then verification would depend on the judgment of personnel with appropriate clearance levels." Williams nodded slowly. "Indeed, and what would you say to someone with such clearance who expressed confidence in your capabilities?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that Williams wasn't just conducting a briefing. He was offering her a choice. She could continue hiding behind her administrative cover, or she could acknowledge what they both knew to be true. The mission in the Balkans was real. The civilian hostages were real, and if she remained silent, people would die who didn't have to die. She looked around the room at officers who'd spent 3 days treating her as an unwelcome bureaucrat. Soon, they would understand why her real personnel file remained classified. "General," Sarah said, her voice taking on a different quality, more controlled, more precise, "I believe we're past the point of theoretical discussion." William straightened almost imperceptibly. Something in Sarah's tone had shifted, and every experienced military officer in the room recognized it. This wasn't the voice of someone discussing hypothetical scenarios anymore. "Continue, Colonel." The Balkans facility represents a classic impossible scenario. Conventional assault guarantees unacceptable casualties. Negotiation provides the hostiles with time to consolidate their position and potentially execute hostages. Standard special operations doctrine offers no viable solution. Sarah moved to the map, her movements now displaying the confidence of someone who'd analyzed similar situations many times before. However, the facility's apparent strengths also represent tactical opportunities for someone willing to operate outside conventional parameters. Major Harrison leaned forward. "What kind of opportunities?" Sarah traced the facility's perimeter with her finger. The elevated position and natural choke points that make conventional assault impossible also limit the hostiles' escape routes. They've essentially trapped themselves in a defensive position that becomes a prison if approached correctly. "Approached how?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "That would depend on specific intelligence regarding hostage locations, hostile movement patterns, and facility infrastructure. Information that's probably available but not included in this briefing." Williams smiled slightly. "And what would you do with such information?" Sarah studied the map for a long moment. The hostiles expect a conventional response because that's how military operations are conducted. They've prepared for negotiation followed by tactical assault. They haven't prepared for an operator who ignores both approaches. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes frowned. "You're talking about infiltration." "I'm talking about mission completion. The specific method would depend on tactical assessment and resource availability." Captain Stevens looked skeptical. "One operator against 12 hostiles. That's not tactics, that's suicide." Sarah turned from the map to face Stevens directly. "Captain, how many combat zones have you operated in?" "4 deployments, ma'am. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia." "And in those deployments, how often did situations develop exactly according to your mission briefing?" Stevens considered the question. "Maybe 20% of the time." "So 80% of your operational experience involved adapting to circumstances that didn't match your preparation." "Yes, ma'am." "Now imagine operating in situations where your mission briefing intentionally contains no tactical guidance because conventional tactics don't apply." The room fell silent as the officers processed this concept. Sarah could see them trying to imagine missions with no predetermined approach, no backup plan, no established protocols to fall back on. Lieutenant Morrison raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what happens when you can't adapt quickly enough?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Then you don't come home, Lieutenant." The blunt honesty of her response sent a chill through the room. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Sarah was describing operations where failure meant death, not just mission incompletion. Major Harrison spoke carefully. "Colonel, your discussion of these scenarios suggests more than academic knowledge." "Major, every military officer studies tactical scenarios. The difference is whether that study remains theoretical or becomes practical application." Williams stepped forward again. "Perhaps we should be more direct. Colonel Chen, do you possess the qualifications necessary for this mission?" Sarah looked around the room at officers who'd spent 3 days viewing her as an administrative transfer. In a few minutes, their entire understanding of who she was would change completely. "General, that would depend on your definition of necessary qualifications." "I'm talking about Specter classification, Colonel. Do you hold Specter classification?" The room became absolutely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet. Every officer present understood they were witnessing a moment that would remain classified for decades. Sarah straightened to full attention. "General, discussing specific classification levels requires proper security protocols." This facility maintains appropriate security clearance for such discussions, Colonel. Sarah nodded slowly. Then yes, sir, I hold Specter classification. The words hit the room like a physical force. Captain Rodriguez's eyes widened. Major Harrison sat back in his chair. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Williams continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And your operational experience with that classification? Extensive, sir. Specific deployments? Classified, sir. But I can confirm successful mission completion in scenarios comparable to the Balkan situation. Captain Stevens found his voice first. Ma'am, your personnel file indicated administrative duties. Captain, my personnel file indicates what it's supposed to indicate. Specter operations require cover assignments that provide operational flexibility while maintaining plausible deniability. Lieutenant Morrison looked confused. So you've been undercover here at Bragg? Sarah smiled slightly. Lieutenant, I've been assigned to Fort Bragg as administrative liaison for strategic planning coordination. That assignment is completely accurate. But it's not the whole story. No, Lieutenant, it's not. Major Harrison leaned forward. How many Specter operations have you completed? That information is classified, Major, but I can tell you that mission success rates justify the classification level. Williams pulled out his tablet again. Colonel, based on your experience, what's your assessment of the Balkans mission? Sarah considered the question seriously. Tactically complex but operationally feasible. The hostiles have prepared for conventional response, which creates exploitable vulnerabilities for unconventional approach. Timeline for mission completion. 6 to 8 hours from insertion to extraction, assuming standard facility layout and typical hostile behavior patterns. Captain Rodriguez looked skeptical. 6 hours to neutralize 12 hostiles and extract multiple civilian hostages. Captain, Specter operations don't follow timelines that make sense from conventional tactical perspective. They follow timelines based on operational necessity and acceptable risk parameters. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes was persistent. Colonel, what exactly would your approach involve? Sarah looked at Williams, who nodded permission to continue. The mission would begin with detailed intelligence gathering to identify hostage locations and hostile movement patterns. Then infiltration using approach vectors that exploit the facility's defensive blind spots. And then neutralization of hostile forces using methods appropriate to the specific tactical situation. Major Harrison pressed for details. What kind of methods? Whatever methods prove necessary for mission completion, while minimizing risk to civilian hostages. The vague response frustrated several officers, but Sarah understood the importance of operational security. Specific tactics remained classified not to protect her, but to protect future operations. Williams stepped forward. Colonel, are you volunteering for this mission? Sarah met his gaze directly. General, that would depend on mission parameters and resource allocation. Assume complete operational autonomy and unlimited resource access. Then yes, sir, I volunteer. The room erupted in whispered conversations as officers tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Their quiet administrative colleague had just volunteered for what everyone understood to be a suicide mission. Williams raised his hand for silence. Colonel, one final question. For the official record, what call sign would you prefer for this operation? Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense. Williams wasn't just asking for a call sign. He was asking her to acknowledge her operational history in front of colleagues who'd never suspected her real background. She could choose something generic, something that revealed nothing about her past. Or she could choose the call sign that had haunted enemy forces across 3 continents. General, she said quietly, Specter 6. The room went dead silent. Not the comfortable silence of people waiting for information, but the profound quiet of people who just heard something that changed everything they thought they knew. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Captain Rodriguez stared at Sarah with his mouth slightly open. Major Harrison had gone completely pale. Lieutenant Morrison looked like he was trying to solve a mathematical equation that wouldn't balance. It was Lieutenant Colonel Barnes who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Specter 6, the Specter 6. Sarah nodded once, a small movement that carried enormous weight. Williams cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I believe some context is appropriate. Colonel Chen, would you mind sharing some historical background for your colleagues?" Sarah looked around the room at faces that had transformed from polite skepticism to something approaching awe. She'd hoped to avoid this moment, but operational necessity had made concealment impossible. "Specter 6 has been my operational call sign for 8 years, she said simply. During that time, I've completed 43 missions across 17 countries. Captain Stevens found his voice. 43? Ma'am, that's impossible. Nobody completes that many high-risk operations. Captain, Specter operations don't follow conventional risk assessment models. They follow success requirements that make statistical analysis irrelevant. Major Harrison leaned forward, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and recognition. The Jakarta extraction in 2019, the one where 6 diplomats walked out of a hostile compound while 12 terrorists simply disappeared. That was you. Sarah met his gaze steadily. That operation remains classified, Major. But the results are public record. 6 hostages rescued, 0 casualties among friendly forces. The Indonesian government never explained how their facility was cleared without any evidence of assault. Major Specter operations are designed to produce results that don't require explanation. Lieutenant Morrison was connecting dots rapidly. The Damascus incident, the arms dealer who vanished from a fortified compound along with his entire security team, no evidence of infiltration, no signs of struggle, like they just stopped existing. Lieutenant, I can neither confirm nor deny involvement in operations that remain under classified status. Captain Rodriguez was scrolling through his phone frantically. Ma'am, there are rumors online about Specter 6, forums where people try to track unexplained military successes. They call you the Ghost Walker. Sarah smiled grimly. Captain, internet speculation rarely aligns with operational reality. Williams stepped forward. Perhaps we should focus on more recent examples. Colonel, the Vienna situation 6 months ago. Sarah hesitated. The Vienna operation was still fresh, still classified at levels that made discussion risky even in secure facilities. General, that mission involved sensitivities that may not be appropriate for current discussion. The broad strokes, Colonel, nothing that compromises ongoing security. Sarah nodded slowly. A diplomat's family was taken from their hotel by a terrorist cell with government connections. Local authorities were either unable or unwilling to assist. Conventional military intervention would have created an international incident. Captain Stevens leaned forward eagerly. What happened? The family was recovered unharmed within 18 hours. The terrorist cell was neutralized. The government officials providing support were reassigned to positions where they could no longer threaten diplomatic personnel. Major Harrison frowned. Reassigned, what does that mean? Sarah met his gaze directly. It means they're no longer in positions where they can threaten anyone, Major. The implication hung in the air like smoke. These officers were beginning to understand that Specter operations existed in a moral landscape that conventional military training didn't adequately prepare them for. Lieutenant Morrison looked troubled. Ma'am, how do you handle the psychological aspects of such operations? Sarah considered the question seriously. Lieutenant, conventional military operations follow rules of engagement designed to maintain moral clarity. Specter operations follow mission requirements that sometimes conflict with conventional moral frameworks. And how do you resolve those conflicts? By remembering that mission failure often results in consequences far worse than mission success. In Vienna, those diplomats' children were 8 and 12 years old. The terrorists had already begun sending their parents photographs. The room fell silent again as the officers processed this information. Sarah could see them struggling with the implications, trying to reconcile their understanding of military ethics with the reality of operations that existed outside normal legal frameworks. Captain Rodriguez spoke carefully. Ma'am, doesn't operating outside legal frameworks make Specter operators criminals? Sarah smiled without humor. Captain, Specter operations exist because conventional legal frameworks are sometimes inadequate for protecting innocent lives. We operate outside those frameworks, but we don't operate outside moral accountability. What's the difference? Legal frameworks are created by governments for governing populations. Moral accountability is personal responsibility for the consequences of our actions. Sometimes those things align, sometimes they don't. Williams consulted his tablet. Colonel, we're running short on time. The Balkans situation is deteriorating. Are you prepared to deploy within 6 hours? Yes, sir, but I'll need access to specific intelligence and equipment requisitions. What kind of intelligence? Facility blueprints, hostage location data, hostile movement patterns, and communication intercepts from the last 12 hours. Major Harrison looked skeptical. That's an enormous amount of information to process in 6 hours. Major Specter operators are trained to process tactical intelligence at accelerated rates. 6 hours is adequate for mission planning. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes asked, "What about equipment requirements?" Sarah pulled out her own tablet and began typing rapidly. "I'll need a complete equipment manifest within 2 hours. Standard insertion gear plus specialized items that I'll list separately." Williams nodded. "Consider it done. Anything else?" Extraction contingencies. I'll need multiple exit strategies prepared, including scenarios where standard extraction becomes impossible. Captain Stevens looked confused. Why would extraction become impossible? Because Specter operations sometimes develop complications that weren't anticipated during mission planning. Having backup extraction plans prevents mission failure from becoming personnel loss. The practical nature of her planning was sobering the officers quickly. This wasn't theoretical discussion anymore. Sarah was preparing for an actual mission that would begin in 6 hours. Williams addressed the room. "Gentlemen, this briefing is now classified at levels that require specific non-disclosure acknowledgement. Captain Rodriguez, please distribute the appropriate documentation." As Rodriguez began pulling forms from a secure cabinet, Williams turned back to Sarah. "Colonel, how much support staff do you require?" "None, sir. Specter operations are conducted solo to maintain operational security and tactical flexibility." Lieutenant Morrison looked alarmed. "Ma'am, you're going into hostile territory completely alone." "Lieutenant, that's how Specter operations work. Support staff creates communication requirements, coordination delays, and additional variables that reduce mission success probability." Major Harrison was reviewing Sarah's equipment list on his tablet. "Colonel, some of these items, these aren't standard military issue. Major Specter operations use whatever equipment proves necessary for mission completion. Standard military issue is designed for conventional operations." "Where do you acquire non-standard equipment?" Williams answered before Sarah could respond. "Major, Specter operators have access to resources that exist outside normal supply chains. Questions about specific sourcing remain classified." The room was beginning to understand that Sarah's operational methods existed in a world they'd never been exposed to. Equipment acquired through mysterious channels, missions conducted without oversight, success achieved through methods that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Sarah looked around the room at officers who would never view her the same way again. In 6 hours, she would be alone in hostile territory, carrying the weight of civilian lives and national security interests. But first, she had to finish preparing for a mission that conventional military doctrine considered impossible. 4 hours later, Sarah stood in the equipment bay checking her gear for the final time. The specialized items had arrived through channels that didn't appear on any official manifest. Night vision optics that enhanced clarity beyond military standard. Communications equipment that operated on frequencies reserved for intelligence agencies. Weapons that bore no manufacturer markings and left no ballistic signatures. Williams entered the bay carrying a secure tablet containing the latest intelligence updates. "Colonel, we have new information about the facility." Sarah looked up from her equipment check. "What kind of information?" "The hostiles have moved the civilians to the building's central conference room. Single entry point, reinforced doors, no windows. It's either the safest location in the facility or the most dangerous." "Depends on their intentions. Are they consolidating for protection or for elimination?" Williams consulted the tablet. Communication intercepts suggest they're preparing for a final ultimatum. If their demands aren't met within 12 hours, they'll begin executing hostages. Sarah nodded grimly. Timeline acceleration. They're worried about military response and moving to conclude the operation. Can you still complete the mission under compressed timing? Compressed timing actually works in my favor. They'll be focused on their ultimatum rather than perimeter security. Gives me operational advantages that wouldn't exist during extended standoff. Major Harrison entered the bay carrying additional intelligence files. Colonel, we've identified 3 of the hostiles through facial recognition. Former special forces, discharged for disciplinary reasons. Sarah reviewed the photographs quickly. What kind of disciplinary issues? Excessive force, disregard for civilian casualties, insubordination regarding rules of engagement. So they're trained but undisciplined. That creates exploitable behavioral patterns. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. Ma'am, the insertion helicopter is ready for departure. Pilot requests final mission briefing. Sarah shouldered her equipment pack. Tell the pilot that insertion coordinates remain classified until we're airborne. Standard radio silence protocols from takeoff to extraction. Williams handed her the secure tablet. Final intelligence package. Real-time updates will be available through encrypted channels. Sarah clipped the tablet to her tactical vest. General, what's the official mission status if media inquiries develop? Training exercise. Routine preparedness drill with allied military units. And if the operation becomes public, then it becomes a successful rescue mission conducted by unspecified military personnel. Sarah smiled slightly. Plausible deniability maintained. Always, Colonel. That's what allows Specter operations to exist. Lieutenant Morrison approached hesitantly. Ma'am, can I ask, what happens if something goes wrong, if you don't make it out? Sarah met his earnest gaze. Lieutenant, every Specter operator accepts that mission completion takes priority over personal survival. If something goes wrong, the mission still succeeds. But how can you be sure? Because Specter 6 doesn't fail, Lieutenant. That's not arrogance, it's operational necessity. Williams checked his watch. Colonel, you have a 5-minute window for departure. Sarah performed a final equipment check, her movements efficient and practiced. 43 missions had taught her the importance of preparation. Every piece of gear had specific purpose. Every contingency had planned response. Captain Stevens watched her preparations with fascination. Ma'am, how do you prepare mentally for something like this? Captain, mental preparation for Specter operations is about accepting that conventional thinking becomes liability. Once you deploy, everything depends on adapting to circumstances that weren't included in any training manual. Doesn't that terrify you? Sarah paused in her preparations. Captain, terror is fear of unknown outcomes. Specter operators learn to function without knowing outcomes. We focus on controlling variables we can influence and adapting to variables we can't. Major Harrison was studying her equipment manifest. Colonel, your gear loadout is unlike anything I've seen. Where did you learn to configure equipment this way? Trial and error, Major. 43 missions teach you what works and what gets you killed. Williams received a message on his tablet. Colonel, the hostiles have just issued their final ultimatum. You now have 10 hours instead of 12. Sarah nodded calmly. Understood, compressed timeline actually improves mission parameters. How so? Panic makes people predictable. They'll be focused on their deadline instead of security protocols. She headed toward the helicopter bay, her colleagues following at a respectful distance. These officers had spent 3 days viewing her as administrative personnel. Now they understood they'd been working alongside one of the military's most classified assets. At the helicopter, Sarah paused to address the group. Gentlemen, in approximately 8 hours, 12 hostages will be free and 12 terrorists will no longer pose a threat to anyone. This conversation never happened. Specter 6 was never here. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes spoke for the group. Colonel, we understand the classification requirements, but speaking personally, it's been an honor to serve with you. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. Colonel, we all serve the same mission, protecting people who can't protect themselves. Classification levels don't change that responsibility. Williams handed her a final communications device. Direct line to command authority. Use it only if mission parameters change dramatically. Understood. Sarah climbed into the helicopter, her equipment secured, and her mind already shifting into operational mode. As the helicopter lifted off, she reviewed the intelligence files one final time. Facility layout memorized, hostile positions analyzed, extraction routes planned, mission timeline calculated. Below her, Fort Bragg grew smaller until it disappeared completely. In 6 hours, she would be alone in hostile territory with only her training and experience to rely on. No backup, no support, no conventional rules of engagement. But that was how Specter 6 operated. Alone, invisible, and utterly committed to mission success. The helicopter banked east toward the Atlantic, carrying Sarah toward another mission that didn't officially exist. Another opportunity to prove that some problems required solutions that couldn't be found in any manual. 3 hours later, General Williams received a secure message that contained only 2 words: mission commenced. The officers who'd attended the morning briefing would spend the next 8 hours wondering what was happening in the Balkans. They would check news feeds, monitor military communications, and search for any indication of the operation they'd witnessed being planned. They would find nothing, because Specter operations existed in the space between official policy and operational necessity. They succeeded because they remained invisible, acknowledged only by the people who came home alive because Specter 6 had been there. 6 hours after the helicopter departed Fort Bragg, Williams received another message. 12 hostiles neutralized, 12 civilians extracted, 0 friendly casualties, Specter 6 returning to base. The mission that conventional military doctrine considered impossible had been completed in half the projected time. When Sarah returned to Fort Bragg the next morning, she would resume her duties as administrative liaison for strategic planning coordination. The officers who'd attended the briefing would treat her with the same professional courtesy they'd shown before. But they would never forget the moment when their quiet colleague had identified herself as Specter 6, and their entire understanding of military operations had changed forever. Some legends, they learned, were actually true.